Here's a question. What kind of company goes bankrupt twice, gets offered to its biggest competitor for pocket change 3 separate times, gets rejected all 3 times, and still builds a $94 billion empire? Because that's the Pepsi story. Between 1922 and 1934, Pepsi-Cola approached Coca-Cola and begged them to buy the brand. The formula, the name, everything, for $50,000. Coca-Cola looked at it, shrugged, and said no. 3 times. That $50,000 is worth about $1 million today. PepsiCo is now worth over $200 billion. But here's what makes this story different from every other underdog tale. Pepsi didn't win by being better. They won by being more desperate, more creative, and more willing to do things that no sane company would attempt, including trading soda for Soviet warships. I'm not making that up. We'll get there. First, let's go back to a pharmacy in North Carolina, because this whole thing starts with a guy trying to cure stomach aches. In 1893, a pharmacist named Caleb Bradham was mixing drinks behind the counter of his drugstore in New Bern, North Carolina. This was the age of the soda fountain, before refrigerators, before vending machines. If you wanted a cold carbonated drink, you went to a pharmacy. And Bradham wasn't just pouring sodas, he was experimenting with them. His obsession was dyspepsia, chronic indigestion. The American diet at the end of the 19th century was brutal. Heavy meats, thick gravies, no fiber. Half the country had stomach problems, and there was a booming market for anything that promised relief. Bradham believed he could create a carbonated drink that actually helped digestion. He mixed sugar, caramel, lemon oil, nutmeg, cola nut extract, and carbonated water. He called it Brad's Drink, which, let's be honest, is a terrible name for anything you want to sell to strangers. His customers at the pharmacy liked it, though. It was fizzy, it was sweet, and it was sharper than that other cola drink coming out of Atlanta. In 1898, he renamed it Pepsi-Cola, after dyspepsia. Not after pepsin, the digestive enzyme. That's a common myth. There was probably never any actual pepsin in the formula. He just liked how the word sounded. Pepsi felt medical and modern. It felt like science. The drink took off. By 1902, Bradham incorporated the Pepsi-Cola Company. By 1903, he had a registered trademark. By 1910, he had franchises in 24 states. He was making money, expanding fast, and riding the soda boom that was sweeping across America. For a small-town pharmacist from North Carolina, things were going remarkably well. And then he made one of the worst financial bets in American business history. During World War I, sugar prices went insane. Before the war, a pound of sugar cost 3 to 5 cents. During the war, it spiked to over 20 cents. Bradham watched that price climb and thought, it's going higher. So he bought massive stockpiles of sugar at peak prices, betting everything, every dollar the company had, on continued inflation. The price crashed to 2 cents a pound. Bradham wasn't just wrong, he was catastrophically wrong. The sugar he'd bought for 20 cents was now worth 1/10 of that. On May 31st, 1923, the Pepsi-Cola Company filed for bankruptcy. Caleb Bradham, the man who invented one of the most famous beverages in history, spent the rest of his life running the same small-town pharmacy where he'd started. He died in 1934 at age 66. He never made another cent from Pepsi. But the brand didn't die with him. A Wall Street broker named Roy Megergel bought the Pepsi trademark for $35,000, believing he could revive it. He couldn't. The formula was inconsistent, the distribution was non-existent, and nobody cared about a dead soda brand. Pepsi-Cola went bankrupt for the second time on June 8, 1931. 2 bankruptcies in 8 years. 3 times offered to Coca-Cola for pennies. 3 times rejected. By 1931, the name Pepsi-Cola was essentially worthless. A pharmaceutical-sounding relic attached to a failed product that nobody wanted to buy, sell, or even think about. If you'd told anyone in America in 1931 that this brand would one day be worth $200 billion, they would have laughed you out of the room. And this is where the story gets interesting. Because the man who saved Pepsi didn't do it out of love, or vision, or business genius. He did it out of pure, petty spite. Charles Guth was the president of Loft Incorporated, a candy company based in Long Island City, New York, that ran 115 retail stores across the East Coast. Every store had a soda fountain, and every soda fountain served Coca-Cola. Loft went through 31,000 gallons of Coca-Cola syrup every single year. That's a massive account, one of Coca-Cola's biggest customers in the entire Mid-Atlantic region. So Guth went to Coca-Cola and asked for a wholesale discount. Just a small price break for a loyal, high-volume customer. A jobber's discount, what any retailer would ask for at that scale. Coca-Cola looked at the request and said no. Not, let's negotiate. Not, we'll think about it. Just no. They considered Loft a retail customer, not a wholesaler, and the price was the price. Now, most people would have grumbled and kept buying Coke. Charles Guth was not most people. He took the rejection personally, and he did something that would accidentally create the second most famous soda brand in history. He went out and bought the entire Pepsi Cola company, the bankrupt, twice-dead zombie brand that nobody wanted, for $10,500. His plan? Replace every single Coca-Cola fountain in every single Loft store with Pepsi. Not because Pepsi was better, because Coca-Cola had insulted him. This is one of the great ironies of business history. Coca-Cola refused to give a candy company a discount on syrup, and in doing so, handed that candy company the ammunition to build a rival that would haunt them for the next century. He ripped out the Coke machines. He installed Pepsi, and then he realized he had a problem. The Pepsi formula was garbage. Bradham's original recipe was inconsistent. Batches tasted different every time. The carbonation was unreliable, and the flavor profile shifted depending on the water source. If Guth was going to serve this to millions of customers, he needed it to taste the same in every glass, in every store, every time. So he hired professional chemists to stabilize the syrup. They standardized the sugar density, the acidity, the carbonation levels. That sounds basic, but in the 1930s, most sodas were still mixed by hand with varying results. Guth turned Pepsi from a pharmacist's experiment into an actual manufactured product. But Guth's story has a twist of its own. He'd used Loft's money and Loft's infrastructure to rebuild Pepsi, but he was quietly putting the profits into his own pocket. In 1935, Loft's board sued him. The case, Guth versus Loft, went all the way to the Delaware Supreme Court. In 1939, the court ruled against Guth. He lost 91% of his Pepsi shares and $475,000. By 1941, Loft formally absorbed Pepsi Cola and renamed itself the Pepsi Cola Company. The man who saved Pepsi out of spite lost it to a lawsuit, but the company survived. And now, for the first time, it had real corporate backing. But here's the problem. You can make the best soda in the world, and it doesn't matter if nobody knows it exists. Coca-Cola owned the shelves, the bottle supply, the advertising space, and the hearts of American consumers. Pepsi was a dead brand brought back by a candy magnate with a grudge. They needed something radical to break through. And what Guth did next didn't just break through. It changed the soda industry forever. In 1934, Pepsi started selling 12-ounce bottles for 5 cents. 5 cents was the same price Coca-Cola charged, but Coke's bottle was only 6.5 ounces. Pepsi was offering people double the soda for the same nickel. And it was 1934. The Great Depression. Unemployment was over 20%. Families were skipping meals. Every single penny mattered. Think about what that pricing meant from a factory standpoint. The profit margins were razor thin, almost non-existent. To make any money at all, Pepsi had to move twice the volume of Coca-Cola. The bottling lines had to run faster than anything the industry had seen. Massive rotating carousels filling and capping dozens of bottles per second, with almost zero tolerance for error. And the bottles themselves? Pepsi couldn't afford new custom glass. Glass was expensive, and Coca-Cola had locked up most of the bottle supply. So Pepsi used repurposed beer bottles. There was an enormous surplus from Prohibition. 12-ounce beer bottles became 12-ounce Pepsi bottles. They weren't pretty. They didn't have the elegant shape of a Coca-Cola contour bottle, but they held double the liquid for the same price. And during the Depression, nobody cared about pretty. In 1939, a pair of songwriters named Alan Kent and Austin Croom Johnson wrote a jingle. Pepsi Cola hits the spot. 12 full ounces. That's a lot. Twice as much for a nickel, too. Pepsi Cola is the drink for you. It hit national radio in 1940 and became what's widely considered the first advertising jingle ever broadcast on national radio in America. By 1941, It had played 296,000 times on 469 stations. Kids sang it on the playground. Workers hummed it in factories. The entire country knew the words. Pepsi wasn't a premium brand. It wasn't trying to be. It was fuel for the working class. Cheap, sweet, caffeinated energy in a recycled beer bottle. And during the darkest economic crisis in American history, that was exactly what people wanted. This was the genius of the Depression-era strategy. Coca-Cola had built its empire on aspiration, a premium product at a premium price, associated with happiness and good times. Pepsi went the opposite direction. It said, "You're broke, you're tired, and you're thirsty. Here's twice as much for the same nickel." While Coca-Cola was selling a feeling, Pepsi was selling math. And during the Depression, math won. By the late 1930s, Pepsi was the second largest selling soft drink in America. Not bad for a brand that had been legally dead 4 years earlier. Pepsi had turned poverty into a business model. But Coca-Cola wasn't standing still. Remember this, because it matters for part 2. While Pepsi was winning the Depression with cheap bottles, Coca-Cola was winning the world. During World War II, Coke struck a deal with the U.S. military to put a bottle of Coca-Cola in the hands of every American soldier, everywhere on Earth, for 5 cents. They built 64 bottling plants on every front of the war. By 1945, Coca-Cola was a global brand with infrastructure on 6 continents. Pepsi was still mostly domestic, still mostly cheap, still mostly the underdog. They needed a breakthrough. And in 1959, they found one in the most unlikely place on Earth, the Soviet Union. On July 24, 1959, the American National Exhibition opened in Sokolniki Park, Moscow. This was the height of the Cold War. Nuclear missiles pointed both ways, school children doing duck and cover drills. The exhibition was a propaganda showcase, America showing the Soviets what capitalism could produce. Vice President Richard Nixon was there to walk Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev through the displays. A Pepsi executive named Donald Kendall had an idea. Kendall ran Pepsi's international division, and he knew that if he could get the most powerful communist leader in the world to drink an American soda on camera, it would be the marketing coup of the century. He pulled strings. He asked Nixon to steer Khrushchev toward the Pepsi booth. Nixon did. Kendall offered Khrushchev 2 cups, one Pepsi made in New York, one made locally in Moscow. Khrushchev drank both. He smiled. He asked for more, and a photographer captured the whole thing. The leader of the Soviet Union, enjoying an American cola, surrounded by American products. That photograph circled the globe. It was reprinted in newspapers on every continent, and it didn't cost Pepsi a single dollar in advertising. It was pure geopolitical theater, and Pepsi had won the scene. But turning a photo opportunity into actual revenue inside the Soviet Union was a completely different challenge. The Soviet ruble wasn't convertible. You couldn't sell Pepsi in Moscow and wire the profits to New York. The money was trapped inside a closed economy with no exit. Any normal company would have walked away. Pepsi wasn't normal. In 1972, they signed one of the strangest trade agreements in commercial history. Pepsi would ship cola concentrate into the USSR. In return, the Soviets would pay not in cash, but in Stolichnaya vodka. Pepsi became the exclusive American distributor of Russia's most famous spirit, effectively running a vodka import business just to fund a soda export business. The first Pepsi plant inside the Soviet Union opened in 1974, producing 160,000 bottles per shift. Pepsi had become the first American consumer product ever manufactured and sold inside the Soviet Union. Coca-Cola, the world's most recognized brand, was completely locked out. And then, in 1989, the deal got truly bizarre. After the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, American consumers had soured on Russian vodka. Sales were tanking. The barter system needed a new currency. So the Soviet government offered Pepsi something nobody could have predicted: military hardware. 17 submarines, 1 cruiser, 1 frigate, 1 destroyer, 20 decommissioned warships, transferred from a nuclear superpower to a soft drink company. At the signing, Pepsi's CEO reportedly told the U.S. National Security Advisor, "We're disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are." Pepsi briefly possessed what some sources called the 6th or 7th largest submarine fleet in the world. They sold every vessel immediately to a Norwegian scrap company. The ships were rusting Cold War relics, barely seaworthy. But the headline was real. A company that makes carbonated sugar water temporarily owned more submarines than most nations on Earth. In 1990, the two sides signed an expanded agreement worth $3 billion, the largest commercial deal in the history of U.S.-Soviet relations. Pepsi was going to build dozens of new plants and even start making Pizza Hut restaurants inside Russia. Then in December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The deal evaporated overnight. But for a brief, surreal window in the late Cold War, Pepsi had accomplished something that no American company, not IBM, not Ford, not Coca-Cola, had managed. It built a manufacturing presence inside the communist world, powered entirely by vodka, champagne, and rusting warships. Now here's the part that nobody talks about. While Pepsi was pulling off the most creative trade deals in Cold War history, they were simultaneously developing a weapon that would hit Coca-Cola right where it lived, in the American shopping mall. And this weapon didn't use vodka or submarines. It used two white cups and human psychology. What happened next triggered the biggest product disaster of the 20th century. In 1975 in Dallas, Texas, Pepsi set up tables in shopping malls with two unmarked white cups. One contained Pepsi, the other contained Coke. Shoppers tasted both and picked their favorite. In test after test, the majority chose Pepsi. They called it the Pepsi Challenge, and it became the most devastating marketing weapon of the Cola Wars. There was real science behind why it worked. Pepsi is engineered to be slightly sweeter and more acidic than Coca-Cola. In a single sip, the amount you get in a taste test, your brain responds more strongly to the sweeter liquid. It triggers a bigger dopamine spike. A 2004 study at Baylor College of Medicine put people in fMRI machines and watched their brains during blind taste tests. The reward center, the ventral putamen, lit up brighter for Pepsi. But here's the twist. When people knew which brand they were drinking, Coca-Cola won. Because the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that handles identity and memory, overrode the taste signal. In other words, Pepsi was winning the tongue. Coke was winning the mind. And the Pepsi Challenge was designed to test only the tongue. The results were devastating. Between 1975 and 1984, Pepsi's market share jumped from 23% to nearly 32%. Coca-Cola fell from over 60% to under 39%. That's a swing worth billions of dollars in a single decade. And Pepsi didn't stop at taste tests. In 1983, they signed Michael Jackson, the single biggest celebrity on the planet, for a $5 million endorsement deal. It was the largest celebrity endorsement in history at the time. Here's the part that must have burned Coca-Cola. They had approached Jackson first. They offered $1 million and pitched it as a targeted campaign. Jackson's team said no, Pepsi quintupled the offer, and the rest is history. Coca-Cola's response? They signed Bill Cosby, a safe, middle-aged comedian, versus the king of pop. It wasn't even close. Coca-Cola panicked. On April 23, 1985, they announced New Coke, a sweeter formula designed to beat Pepsi in blind taste tests. It lasted 79 days. 40,000 furious phone calls and letters later, they brought back the original. Their own president said afterward, "All the time and money and skill poured into consumer research could not measure the deep and abiding emotional attachment to original Coca-Cola." We'll get into exactly what happened and the wild conspiracy theories around it in part 2. But the point is this. Pepsi, the twice bankrupt soda brand from a small-town pharmacy, had scared the most dominant beverage company on earth into changing its own recipe. And they did it with 2 white cups and a question. But Pepsi wasn't just fighting Coca-Cola with marketing. They were quietly building something that Coca-Cola never even attempted, a food empire. In 1964, PepsiCo acquired Mountain Dew, a regional citrus soda with one of the strangest origin stories in the beverage industry. It was invented in the 1940s by 2 brothers in Tennessee, Barney and Allie Hartman, and the name Mountain Dew is old Southern slang for moonshine. The original label featured a barefoot hillbilly named Willie carrying a banjo and a jug of hooch. The drink was created as a whiskey mixer. It debuted in Johnson City, Tennessee in 1946, and its entire brand identity was built around Appalachian bootlegging culture. It was the least corporate product in American history. Pepsi took that hillbilly drink, cranked the caffeine to the legal maximum, and re-engineered it into an energy weapon aimed squarely at teenage boys and young men. They ditched the moonshine branding, replaced it with extreme sports and neon green, and created an entirely new category. Not cola, not orange soda, something faster, something louder. And Coca-Cola had absolutely nothing like it. Mountain Dew became PepsiCo's secret growth engine, a brand that printed money without directly competing with Coca-Cola at all. Then came the move that separated Pepsi from every other beverage company on Earth, permanently. On June 8, 1965, Pepsi-Cola merged with Frito-Lay to create PepsiCo, Incorporated. And the logic behind this merger was so simple it was almost sinister. Salty snacks make you thirsty. Soda quenches thirst. If you control both sides of that equation, you own a self-reinforcing loop of consumption that feeds itself. You walk into a convenience store, you grab a bag of Doritos. Your brain tells your mouth it needs something cold and sweet. There's a Pepsi right there on the shelf next to the chips. Cold, sweating, practically begging you to pick it up. That's not coincidence. That proximity is engineered down to the inch. PepsiCo built a massive direct store delivery system, thousands of trucks driven by driver salesmen who stocked both the chip aisle and the soda aisle, making sure their products were always together, always within reach. Coca-Cola never did this. Coca-Cola believed in focus. One industry, one product category, one mission. PepsiCo believed in ecosystems, snacks and drinks, salty and sweet, together forever. By the 1990s, PepsiCo was a machine. They acquired Gatorade, the sports drink invented at the University of Florida, which gave them dominance in hydration. They bought Quaker Oats, which gave them breakfast. They already had Tropicana for juice. Every meal, every snack break, every workout, PepsiCo had a product for it. Today, PepsiCo owns 23 brands that each generate over $1 billion a year. Lay's, Doritos, Cheetos, Gatorade, Quaker Oats, Tropicana, Mountain Dew, and of course, Pepsi itself. Total revenue in 2025, $93.9 billion, 306,000 employees, 200 countries, from a bankrupt pharmacy soda to one of the largest food and beverage companies on the planet, in one lifetime. And here's the number that blows people's minds. PepsiCo earns almost twice as much money as Coca-Cola. $94 billion versus $48 billion. But on the stock market, Coca-Cola is worth $327 billion. PepsiCo is worth $211 billion. The company that makes half the revenue is valued 55% higher. Because Wall Street worships Coca-Cola's pure beverage, high-margin model, and it discounts PepsiCo's messy, snack-heavy, lower-margin approach. So who actually won the cola wars? Ask 10 people. You'll get 10 different answers. Revenue? Pepsi wins by nearly double. Stock market value? Coke, and it's not even close. Cultural recognition? Coke. It's the most recognized brand in human history. Strategic creativity? Pepsi. Nobody else traded soda for Warships or merged with a chip company to hack human thirst. Number of Cold War submarines owned? Definitely Pepsi. Nobody's even second. But here's the thing. You've just heard the Challenger's version of this story. The scrappy underdog that went bankrupt, got rejected, and clawed its way to a $94 billion empire through spite, cheap bottles, a vodka barter pipeline, and a blind taste test that hacked the human brain. Now it's time to hear the other side. Because Coca-Cola didn't become the most recognized brand in human history by accident. Their story starts in another pharmacy, in another southern town, just 7 years before Bradham's. Except this pharmacist wasn't trying to cure indigestion. He was a Civil War veteran trying to escape morphine addiction. And his original formula, the one he sold at Jacob's Pharmacy in Atlanta for 5 cents a glass, contained cocaine. That's part 2.